Hey there, dreamers. Welcome back to our channel. Before we drift into the classic journey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide our sleepy little community reaches. All right, without further ado, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. If you were to wander into the quiet streets of Danville on a soft, late afternoon, you might stumble upon a quaint little shop tucked away on the corner, its windows glowing with the kind of golden light that seems to invite passers-by to slow down. This is Fletcher's Antiques, a place that holds more than just old clocks and dusty books. It holds the gentle heart of Lawrence Fletcher himself. Lawrence is not the kind of man who seeks excitement in the grand or the flashy. Where others see a cracked vase or a worn-out chair, Lawrence sees stories. He has a collector's eye, not just for objects, but for meaning. Each item in his shop has lived a life before, and Lawrence delights in uncovering those hidden histories. His gentle hands lift each piece with care, as if cradling a memory too delicate to be rushed. It is in these quiet moments, standing among shelves of curiosities, that Lawrence feels most at home. He enjoys listening to the ticking of an old grandfather clock as it keeps steady time, or the faint, musty smell of old books whose pages whisper of years long gone. To Lawrence, every item is like a small doorway to another world, a reminder that even the simplest objects carry with them the echoes of the people who once loved them. Some days, a child wanders into the shop, eyes wide with curiosity, pointing to an odd contraption on the shelf. Lawrence never rushes these moments. He kneels down, smiling kindly, and explains in his calm British voice what the object once was, weaving a gentle story around it. It might be a lantern that once guided sailors home at night, or a carved box that once carried someone's most treasured letters. Whether the story is entirely accurate or softened by Lawrence's imagination doesn't quite matter. The effect is the same. The child leaves with wonder, and the shop feels a little warmer for it. Lawrence collects not for wealth or prestige, but because he finds comfort in the persistence of things. In a world that moves quickly, where each day blends into the next, antiques remind him that life is made up of countless little moments, each one leaving a mark. That is why he will spend long evenings polishing an old coin or gently repairing the frayed corner of a painting's frame. It is not simply about restoring the item. It is about honoring the story that it carries. He often thinks of it as a form of companionship. An old record player, though scratched and faded, still hums when the needle touches its grooves. A tarnished teapot, though long past its shining days, still pours a gentle stream. These things remind Lawrence of people, how no matter the years, there is still beauty in what they offer. The townsfolk of Danville sometimes chuckle at his little shop. To them, it's a quiet corner they might step into once or twice a year when looking for something unusual. But to Lawrence, it is more than a business. It is a haven, a place where history rests safely, where the hurried pace of the world can slow down for a while. In the evenings, when the street outside grows dim and the soft glow of lamps fills the windows, Lawrence can often be found at his counter, spectacles perched on his nose, carefully cataloging the day's new finds. He doesn't rush the process. Each entry is written neatly with thoughtful notes in the margins, sometimes about the item's history, other times about the way it made him feel. It is a kind of journaling, one that turns his collection into more than a store. It becomes a diary of stories he wishes to preserve. For Lawrence, this gentle act of collecting is not just a hobby. It is a philosophy, a way of life that says even the small, forgotten things deserve to be remembered. There is a special kind of patience that comes with being a collector, and Lawrence embodies it in every part of his life. He doesn't hurry through the day the way others might, darting from one errand to the next. Instead, he moves gently, as though he understands that time itself is an antique, precious, irreplaceable, and best enjoyed slowly. When he walks through a flea market or stumbles upon a small yard sale, his eyes don't seek out the biggest or the most impressive piece. No, Lawrence is drawn to the overlooked things, the ones others might leave behind. A chipped teacup, a clock missing its hands, a weathered photograph whose edges have curled with age. He picks them up carefully as though greeting an old friend who has been waiting for him. To many, these items would appear useless. But Lawrence sees them differently. He imagines the families who once gathered around that teacup, pouring tea on a rainy afternoon. He pictures the hands that wound the clock each morning, trusting it to keep the rhythm of the day. He wonders about the face in the faded photograph. What stories did that person live? What laughter and sorrows were captured in that frozen moment? In these quiet imaginings, Lawrence feels connected to lives he never knew, bound by the simple thread of humanity. Back at his shop, these discoveries are given a kind of new life. He cleans them, not with the goal of making them perfect again, but of honoring their journey. A gentle polish here, a soft cloth there, enough to show their beauty while still preserving the marks of time. He likes to say that imperfections are not flaws, but signatures. They are proof that something has truly lived. His sons, Phineas and Ferb, sometimes help him carry items back to the shop. While the boys are usually buzzing with grand inventions and wild summer projects, Lawrence enjoys these quieter moments with them. He doesn't always understand the full extent of their engineering marvels, but he doesn't mind. He sees in their eyes the same spark of curiosity that he feels when holding an old compass or a worn book. Curiosity takes many forms, and he treasures theirs as much as his own. In fact, it's not unusual for Lawrence to weave his love of antiques into bedtime tales for the boys. Instead of reading from a book, he might hold up an old coin and spin a story about where it might have traveled, or he might take out a faded map and describe the adventures it must have guided. His stories aren't meant to be historically exact. They are meant to soothe, to open the imagination, and to remind his children that every object holds a little magic. Even Linda, his wife, sometimes smiles when she finds him lost in thought over a peculiar object. She may tease him gently. Honestly, Lawrence, do we really need another grandfather clock? But she admires his passion. For Lawrence, it is never about need. It is about appreciation. He believes that every piece, no matter how small, deserves to be seen, understood, and cherished. In the stillness of the shop, when the day is done and the streets of Danville are quiet, Lawrence feels most at peace. He'll often linger a little longer, walking among the shelves, fingertips brushing against the edges of frames and the spines of books. Each touch is like a greeting, a reassurance to the objects that they are safe here. And perhaps, in a way, Lawrence feels safe among them too. For in this collection of curiosities, he has built more than a shop. He has built a sanctuary where the past and present sit side by side in gentle harmony, and where the hurried world outside cannot intrude. There is something almost magical about the way Lawrence tells a story. He never raises his voice or rushes through the words. Instead, he speaks slowly, each sentence rolling out like a soft wave upon the shore. When he holds an antique in his hands, it is as though the object itself whispers to him, and he translates its language into a tale that anyone can understand. One evening, for example, Phineas had been looking curiously at an old pocket watch that sat on the counter. Its glass face was cracked, and the chain had long since lost its shine. Most would have dismissed it as broken, but Lawrence lifted it gently, turning it over in his palm. "This watch," he said in his warm, accented voice, "may have once belonged to a traveler. Imagine them setting off early in the morning, with the sun still low, checking this very watch as they boarded a train." Phineas leaned closer, eyes widening with interest. "Where were they going, Dad?" Lawrence smiled, letting the question linger in the air. "Perhaps to visit family. Perhaps to start a new adventure. The beauty is, we may never know for certain. But in that mystery lies a story. Every time it ticked, it marked a moment in someone's life, and here it is now, still ticking in its own quiet way." Ferb, ever the silent listener, seemed to treasure these moments as well. He might not speak often, but he would hold the object carefully, studying it as though he too could feel its story. Lawrence admired this. Ferb's ability to understand without words mirrored his own love for silent, enduring things. Even the visitors to the shop sometimes found themselves swept into Lawrence's gentle storytelling. A customer might come in searching for a practical purchase, only to leave with something entirely unexpected. Perhaps they came for a lamp but walked out with a weathered globe after hearing Lawrence describe the countless hands that had spun it, dreaming of distant places. Or they might fall in love with a stack of letters tied together with ribbon after he read aloud a line that spoke of kindness, written decades ago. In these moments, Lawrence wasn't just selling antiques. He was giving people a chance to pause, to dream, to connect with the past in a way that felt personal. Many would thank him quietly, sometimes with a softened expression, as though they had just been reminded of something important yet forgotten. At night, after the shop was closed, Lawrence would sometimes sit in his favorite armchair with a small box of trinkets at his side. He didn't need a grand audience, just the quiet ticking of the clock and the soft glow of a lamp. He might pick up a brass key, smooth and cold to the touch, and wonder aloud what door it once opened, or he would study a faded postcard, imagining the journey it had taken across oceans to deliver a message of love or longing. In these quiet musings, Lawrence felt as though he were keeping the company of invisible friends. He did not feel lonely. On the contrary, he felt surrounded by lives that had touched these objects, each leaving behind a trace. The shop was not just filled with antiques, it was filled with echoes of humanity, gentle and enduring. And perhaps that was what drew people back to Fletcher's antiques, even if they didn't fully realize why. It wasn't just the items themselves, but the way Lawrence treated them, with dignity, curiosity, and warmth. Every object had a place, and every person who walked through the door left feeling a little lighter, as though they too had been reminded that their own life, with all its small and ordinary details, was a story worth remembering. As the day winds down in Danville, the streets grow quieter, and the glow of street lamps begins to flicker across the sidewalks. Inside Fletcher's Antiques, Lawrence often takes a final walk around the shop before locking up. He moves slowly, not because he has to, but because he wants to give each item one last glance, almost as though bidding them good night. The lamps cast long, gentle shadows across the shelves, and the air is filled with that comforting blend of polished wood and old paper. In these solitary evening moments, Lawrence reflects on why he has chosen this path. He could have rushed into some fast-moving business, something louder or more competitive. But that was never what he wanted. His joy does not come from profit or prestige. It comes from presence, from being here, surrounded by reminders of lives that once were, and carrying them carefully into the present. To Lawrence, collecting is a way of holding on to stillness. Each object slows time just a little, asking for attention and care. A simple coin invites him to think about the countless hands it has passed through. A violin, even if its strings are frayed, calls to mind the music it once carried into the world. These items become anchors, steady and patient, reminding him that even as the world hurries forward, there is value in pausing and listening to the echoes. At home, his family sometimes teases him for his endless fascination with antiques, but they also know how much peace it brings him. Linda admires the way his eyes soften when he tells a story, and the boys treasure the way he can turn an ordinary trinket into an adventure of the imagination. It is through his love of old things that Lawrence shares a gentleness that words alone could not always express. Even when no one is watching, Lawrence carries this quiet appreciation with him. He might stop on a walk to admire the ironwork on an old gate, or pause to listen to the creak of a wooden floorboard, hearing music where others hear only noise. He has taught himself through years of collecting to notice the overlooked details. In a way, his life has become its own kind of collection, not of objects, but of small, tender moments. Before bed, he sometimes sits with a book in his lap, though he doesn't always read it. Instead, he lets his thoughts drift. He recalls the shop, the faces of customers who left with lighter steps, the laughter of his sons as they listened to his stories. He thinks of the antiques waiting patiently on their shelves, ready to share their quiet magic again tomorrow. And in these reflections, he feels content. For Lawrence Fletcher, collecting is not about filling shelves. It is about filling life with meaning. Each object is a reminder that we too leave behind marks of our days, small traces of who we are. And perhaps that is why, surrounded by his antiques, Lawrence always feels a gentle calm. They are more than objects. They are companions in stillness, teachers of patience, keepers of memory. As the lights dim and the night settles in, Lawrence finally rests, secure in the knowledge that he has preserved something beautiful, however small, for another day. And with that thought, the little shop sleeps too, quiet, timeless, and waiting for the morning light. There is a gentle rhythm to Lawrence Fletcher's life in Danville, a rhythm that is neither hurried nor complicated. He rises in the morning not with the blaring urgency of alarms, but with the natural ease of someone who enjoys greeting the day slowly. The sun slips through the curtains in pale golden beams, and Lawrence takes a moment to simply stretch, adjust his glasses on the bedside table, and notice the quiet before the house stirs awake. Though the Flynn Fletcher household is lively, filled with the boundless creativity of Phineas and the quiet ingenuity of Ferb, Lawrence himself is a grounding presence. His mornings often begin with a familiar routine, the kettle whistling softly in the kitchen, the rich aroma of tea leaves steeping, and the sound of toast popping up with a gentle click. He prefers his mornings calm, with a newspaper folded neatly beside his plate and a comfortable chair waiting by the window. There is nothing extravagant about these moments. In fact, it is their ordinariness that makes them so special. He sits with his tea in hand, taking slow sips, and lets his eyes wander over the headlines, though sometimes his mind drifts to more pleasant things. A curious antique he saw the day before, a story he might tell his sons that evening, or the way the garden outside seems to change with the passing seasons. The garden itself is another of Lawrence's quiet joys. He is not an ambitious gardener. He does not demand perfect hedges or grand displays, but he takes pleasure in the simple act of caring for plants. He will kneel in the grass with a small trowel, patting the soil around the roots of a flower, or gently trimming stray branches from the shrubs. Birds often flutter nearby, and Lawrence greets them as though they were neighbors, offering a soft hum of acknowledgement before returning to his work. As the day continues, Lawrence might stroll into town. He does not rush. His steps are unhurried, the kind of walk that invites noticing small details others might miss. He pauses to admire a quaint sign outside a shop, to look at the architecture of an old building, or to chat amiably with a passerby. To him, these small interactions are as valuable as any grand adventure. They remind him that community is built not on extraordinary gestures, but on the accumulation of simple kindnesses. In the marketplace, Lawrence is something of a familiar figure. Shopkeepers know him by name, and many greet him warmly as he passes. He is not the sort to haggle aggressively or demand special treatment. Instead, he smiles, asks after their day, and accepts goods with gratitude. A bag of fresh fruit, a loaf of bread, a few odds and ends, each chosen with the same care he applies to antiques. For Lawrence, the act of purchasing is not merely a transaction, but a moment of connection. Sometimes, while walking home, he will stop at a bench near the park. Sitting there, he enjoys watching the world move around him. Children play, dogs tug at their leashes, and the occasional bicyclist whirs by. Lawrence observes it all with a kind of quiet contentment, as though he is witnessing a living painting. He does not feel the need to insert himself into every scene. Simply being present is enough. And so the day continues in this steady, peaceful rhythm. Lawrence is not without responsibilities, of course. His antique shop awaits him, and his family depends on his kindness and steadiness. But he approaches each task with patience rather than urgency. In this way, his life becomes a gentle contrast to the busier, louder lives around him. He is not swept up in the chaos of constant motion. Instead, he provides an anchor, a reminder that life's beauty often lies in its quieter chapters. In Danville, a place brimming with invention and surprises, Lawrence's quiet days might seem unremarkable. But to those who know him well, they are treasures. Proof that peace and joy can be found not only in the extraordinary, but also in the ordinary if one has the heart to notice. By the time the sun reaches its place high above Danville, Lawrence is often found at his antique shop. The door creaks open with a familiar chime, a sound that never fails to comfort him. It is not the kind of store that bustles with endless customers or loud chatter. Rather, it is a quiet retreat where time seems to flow at its own pace. The shelves are neatly arranged, though not overly polished. Lawrence likes the way certain objects look a little worn, a little lived in, as if they carry their history proudly. A brass lamp, dulled but sturdy, sits beside a stack of weathered books. A grandfather clock ticks patiently in the corner, each chime echoing like the heartbeat of the shop. There is even a small record player tucked away on a table, ready to fill the room with soft music if the mood strikes him. Lawrence moves through the shop like a gentle curator. He dusts the tops of shelves, carefully straightens a picture frame, and sometimes pauses to adjust his glasses so he can study an object more closely. He enjoys these little tasks, not because they demand much effort, but because they connect him to the treasures in his care. Each touch feels like a quiet reassurance, a way of saying, "I see you. You are remembered." Occasionally, the bell above the door rings and a customer steps inside. Lawrence always greets them warmly, never pushing a sale or hovering too closely. He understands that browsing antiques is a personal experience. People wander, they linger, they let their eyes fall on the things that speak to them. He respects this silence, offering his presence when asked, but never intruding. When he does share words, they are usually gentle explanations. A young couple once admired a small wooden chest, curious about its faded carvings. Lawrence smiled and explained that it might have been used to hold letters, precious tokens, or keepsakes long ago. He didn't claim certainty. Instead, he invited imagination. Perhaps, he said softly, it held a collection of love letters, kept safe through many seasons. Or maybe it was where a child placed their small treasures, marbles, shells, tiny things that mattered dearly to them. The couple's eyes softened, and though they didn't purchase the chest, they left with smiles, carrying with them the warmth of the story. Not every visitor is searching for history, of course. Some stop by simply to chat, drawn by the calm atmosphere. Lawrence is never too busy for a kind conversation. He listens more than he speaks, nodding thoughtfully and responding with gentle humor or quiet wisdom. For many in Danville, Fletcher's Antiques is not only a shop but a resting place, a pause in the middle of their day. Sometimes Phineas and Ferb drop by after their adventures. Their energy fills the shop like a burst of sunlight, and Lawrence welcomes it without hesitation. He doesn't always follow the details of their latest invention, but he listens intently, smiling at their enthusiasm. To him, it doesn't matter whether he understands the mechanics of a roller coaster built in a backyard or a rocket headed for the moon. What matters is the joy in their voices, the spark in their eyes. His role, he feels, is to encourage, to provide the steady ground from which they can leap. On quieter afternoons, when no one is in the shop, Lawrence sometimes sits at his counter with a small notebook. In it, he records his thoughts, not just about the antiques, but about the day itself. A kind word he heard, a bird that landed near his window, the way the sunlight shifted across the shelves. These small notes are not meant to be published or even shared. They are simply his way of acknowledging the little details that give each day its shape. As the afternoon drifts toward evening, Lawrence feels content. His shop is not a place of wealth or grandeur, but of gentleness and meaning. Each object, each interaction, each quiet pause becomes a thread in the fabric of his days. And for Lawrence Fletcher, these are the treasures that matter most. Evenings in the Flynn-Fletcher household are never dull, though Lawrence manages to find tranquility within the whirl of activity. By the time he locks up his antique shop and strolls home, the sun has begun its slow descent, painting the sky with warm hues of orange and lavender. The air is filled with the faint scent of dinner drifting from nearby homes, and Lawrence takes in the quiet hum of Danville life as he walks. When he steps through the door, he is greeted not only by the cozy familiarity of his home, but often by the cheerful chaos of his family. Phineas might be finishing the explanation of their latest project, his voice bubbling with excitement. Ferb, though quieter, will nod or gesture, occasionally offering a witty remark that never fails to make Lawrence chuckle. Candace might be pacing the living room, exasperated but determined, muttering about catching her brothers. Lawrence watches these scenes with fond amusement. He doesn't always intervene, nor does he feel the need to. He simply enjoys the way his family fills the home with life. To him, their energy is a blessing, proof that the house is not just walls and rooms, but a living, breathing place of love. Linda, ever thoughtful and steady in her own way, often prepares dinner while humming softly to herself. Lawrence will sometimes step into the kitchen to offer his help, though she teases that he spends more time chatting than cooking. Still, he enjoys these small moments together, washing vegetables at the sink, stirring a pot, or simply standing nearby to keep her company. The glow of the kitchen light, the clatter of dishes, and the familiar rhythm of domestic life soothe him more than he can say. Dinner itself is a lively affair. Around the table, Conversation flows in many directions at once, Phineas detailing their day's adventure, Ferb adding a quiet but clever comment, Candace jumping in with determination to set the record straight, and Linda gently reminding everyone to eat before their food gets cold. Lawrence sits comfortably in his chair, contributing here and there, but mostly he listens. His gaze moves from one family member to another, and he feels deeply grateful for the simple, shared time. After dinner, the pace of the evening softens. Candace might retreat to her room. Phineas and Ferb might dart outside for a final burst of imagination before nightfall, and Linda tidies up with her familiar, efficient grace. Lawrence, meanwhile, often gravitates toward his favorite armchair in the living room. A lamp glows warmly at his side, casting golden light over the pages of a book. Though he loves antiques, his reading choices vary. Sometimes a historical account, sometimes a gentle novel, and occasionally even a book of poetry. He doesn't rush through them. Instead, he lets each sentence linger, like sipping a well-brewed cup of tea. Sometimes he doesn't even read at all, but rather sits with the book open in his lap, lost in thought while the soft background sounds of his family drift around him. On special evenings, the family gathers together for a quieter activity, perhaps watching a movie, playing a board game, or simply talking. Lawrence cherishes these moments deeply. They do not need to be extraordinary to matter. Their value lies in the closeness they create. He delights in Linda's laughter, in Phineas's endless curiosity, in Ferb's subtle humor, and even in Candace's dramatic declarations. Each voice, each presence, is a note in the song of his home. As the night deepens, the household gradually winds down. Lights dim, doors close softly, and silence begins to settle. Lawrence lingers a little longer in his chair, content to be the last one awake. He gazes around the room, the photographs on the walls, the little trinkets on the shelves, the faint glow of the lamp, and feels a deep sense of belonging. These are the quiet days he treasures, not because they are remarkable, but because they are his. The night deepens in the Fletcher home, and the rooms gradually grow quieter. Lawrence lingers in the living room, the glow of a single lamp resting softly against the furniture. The faint ticking of the clock keeps him company, steady and patient. He closes the book in his lap, not because he is finished, but because he wants to sit with the quiet. The house has its own gentle rhythm at this hour. Candace's footsteps shuffle down the hallway as she moves restlessly before bed. Phineas and Ferb whisper in their room, planning tomorrow's adventure with the same enthusiasm they carried through the day. From the kitchen comes the faint clink of dishes as Linda tidies the last of the evening's meal. Lawrence takes comfort in these sounds, each one familiar and reassuring, each one proof that the house is alive with the presence of those he loves. He makes a few notes in his journal, writing carefully under the lamplight. The words are simple, observations of the day, the way the sunset looked over Danville, or how a neighbor stopped by the shop to share a story. Lawrence doesn't write long passages, only fragments, but each line feels like a seed planted, a memory saved. Closing the notebook gently, he lets out a small breath and adjusts his glasses. Before going upstairs, he pauses at the window. The streets outside are calm, the street lamps glowing like quiet beacons along the road. The world feels unhurried at this hour, and Lawrence appreciates how the stillness seems to hold its own kind of story. He stands there for a moment longer, allowing himself to feel part of it, before turning away. In the hallway, he passes by the boys' room. The door is slightly open, and he hears the muffled hum of their voices. He doesn't intrude, but he smiles softly to himself, knowing well that their dreams of tomorrow are already taking shape. Candace's room is quieter, though he imagines she is still awake, holding on to her determination even as the night winds down. When he finally makes his way to the bedroom, Linda is already there, resting with her eyes half closed. He slips quietly inside, careful not to disturb her, and places his glasses on the nightstand. As he prepares for sleep, his thoughts drift again. Not to grand adventures or distant memories, but to the simple rhythm of Danville life. The market stalls, the antique shelves, the laughter at the dinner table. These are the pieces of his world that give it weight and warmth. The Fletcher home settles fully into silence, but Lawrence knows that tomorrow will carry the same gentle balance. The calm of his own quiet routines woven together with the bright, inventive energy of his family. It is this balance, more than anything, that gives his days their shape. There are evenings when Lawrence Fletcher sits in his antique shop long after the door has been locked and the last light of day has faded beyond the windows. To most, the shop would seem quiet, perhaps even empty. Yet to Lawrence it feels alive with the voices of the past. Each shelf, each drawer, each worn object holds within it a story. And Lawrence has always been one to listen. He runs a finger along the spine of a cracked leather book, pausing to admire the faint gold lettering still clinging to its cover. Who once turned these pages? Was it read by candlelight in a modest home, or perhaps carried on a long journey, its words offering comfort along the way? He does not know for certain, but that has never lessened his fascination. If anything, the unknown invites him to imagine. In truth, Lawrence has always been a storyteller at heart. It is not enough for him to collect antiques simply as objects. He feels compelled to explore the lives that touched them. A silver locket, for example, may have belonged to someone who treasured a portrait inside, carrying it close through joy and sorrow. A simple teacup chipped along the rim may have been part of countless conversations, laughter shared between friends, quiet mornings at the kitchen table. When customers visit the shop, Lawrence often shares these possibilities. He never claims certainty, for certainty is not always necessary. Instead, he weaves gentle stories that allow others to see more than just the surface. Children especially enjoy these tales, listening with wide eyes as he speaks of sailors who navigated by the stars or inventors who scribbled sketches in old notebooks. Sometimes the stories are grand, but more often they are small and tender. Reminders that history is built from ordinary lives, not only extraordinary deeds. At home, Lawrence carries this same spirit. Phineas and Ferb are always eager for new stories, and though their inventions often aim for the spectacular, they listen closely when their father shares accounts of the past. He tells them about the craftsmanship of old clocks, how each gear was carefully set by hand, or about the artistry of furniture carved without modern tools. They may not always sit still for long, but Lawrence can see their imagination sparking. To him, that is enough. Candace, too, listens, though she sometimes rolls her eyes at her father's rambling. Yet even she cannot help but soften when he tells a particularly touching tale. Lawrence knows she hears more than she admits, and he takes comfort in that. Linda, for her part, admires his devotion to the past. She may tease him gently about filling the house with knickknacks, but she values the depth of his perspective, the way he can make even the smallest relic feel important. For Lawrence, storytelling is not about entertainment alone. It is about connection. When he holds an antique in his hand and imagines his journey, he feels linked to people he has never met, to times he has never lived. Sharing these thoughts with his family and neighbors creates bridges between past and present, reminding them all that they, too, are part of an unfolding story. Some nights, as he sits in the lamplight of the shop, Lawrence allows himself to dream more vividly. He closes his eyes and pictures the hands that once held a compass, guiding a traveler through unknown lands. He imagines the scratch of quill on parchment, the laughter around a dinner table, the hopeful glance of someone carrying a love letter. These images come to him not as ghosts, but as gentle companions, fragments of life that still shimmer faintly in the objects left behind. The past, he believes, is never truly gone. It lingers quietly in the corners of rooms, in the grooves of wood, and the pages of old books. To notice it, one only needs patience and imagination, two qualities Lawrence has carried with him since his earliest days. And in noticing, in listening, he finds a deep and steady peace. On one particularly quiet afternoon in Danville, Lawrence decided to bring home a few items from the shop. He thought it might be pleasant to share their histories with the family over dinner, weaving gentle tales between bites of Linda's cooking. It was not unusual for him to do this. Sometimes the table would hold more relics than plates, but tonight he had chosen carefully, objects that spoke to him with a certain intimacy. The first was a brass compass, its surface dulled by years of handling. Phineas was the first to pick it up, his fingers tracing the arrow as it wavered toward north. "Imagine," Lawrence said softly, "this little compass may once have guided someone across wide oceans or dense forests. Perhaps it belonged to a sailor who braved the waves, or an explorer who trusted this very needle to bring him safely home." Phineas's eyes sparkled. He turned the compass in his hands and said, "I bet whoever used it had adventures every single day." Ferb, quiet as always, nodded with a knowing smile. Lawrence chuckled warmly. He had seen that expression before, a spark of curiosity ready to bloom into invention. Next, he produced an old pocket watch. Its chain was slightly tangled, the cover dented on one side. Lawrence wound it carefully until the tiny ticking filled the kitchen, a sound both steady and soothing. Time," he said, gazing at the watch, "was once carried in the palm of one's hand. This piece may have marked the hours of a man walking to work, or perhaps a woman waiting for a loved one to return home. Each tick is a heartbeat of history." Candace leaned closer than she intended, her skepticism softening as she listened. "Do you really think about all that when you look at things?" she asked. Lawrence smiled. "Oh, yes. Every item has lived a little life. And when we pause to wonder, we honor that life, even if we never know the full tale." Linda, amused and touched, poured tea into her cup and said, "Well, if anyone can make an old watch sound like poetry, it's you, dear." After dinner, the family gathered in the living room where Lawrence unveiled the third item, a faded photograph tucked in a simple wooden frame. The picture showed a family seated stiffly in their Sunday clothes, their expressions solemn yet affectionate. "I've never known their names," Lawrence admitted. "But whenever I look at them, I like to imagine what their lives were like. Did they laugh together when the camera wasn't pointed their way? Did they tell stories much like we are now? Somewhere their laughter still echoes." Phineas tilted his head, gazing at the photograph. "It's like, even though they're gone, they're still part of the world because you remember them." Lawrence's heart swelled at the boy's words. "Exactly, Phineas. Remembering, even imagining, is a kind of keeping alive." As the evening grew deeper, the children wandered toward their own pursuits, but Lawrence remained by the photograph, watching the way the lamplight touched the faded smiles. He often wondered if years from now someone might hold a picture of his family with similar curiosity. Would they marvel at Phineas's energy, at Ferb's quiet wisdom, at Candace's determination? Would they see Linda's warmth and his own gentle fascination with the past? The thought comforted him. For Lawrence, the past and present were not separate worlds, but threads in the same tapestry, woven tightly together. Every story told today would someday become history. Every laugh, every invention, every moment around the dinner table would leave a trace for others to discover. And so he continued to share. At the shop, he told customers about the compass and the watch, not with certainty, but with possibility. Children listened wide-eyed. Adults smiled at the poetry of it all. In these moments, Lawrence felt he was not merely selling antiques. He was passing along sparks of imagination, keeping the flame of history alive in gentle ways. There were moments when Lawrence's storytelling drifted not only toward the antiques in his shop, but to the memories of his own youth. Though he had spent much of his life in England before settling in Danville, the rhythm of the past followed him like a familiar melody. When the children asked about his younger days, he was more than happy to oblige, turning the evening into a quiet journey through time. He recalled, for instance, the village where he grew up. Its cobblestone streets were lined with old brick houses, and at the center stood a clock tower that rang each hour with a gentle chime. As a boy, Lawrence had spent many afternoons gazing up at its face, fascinated by the turning of the hands. "I suppose," he said with a smile, "that may be where my love of clocks began." The sound of that tower was like a heartbeat for the town, steady, reassuring, always there. Phineas leaned forward, eager to hear more. "Did you ever climb it?" Lawrence chuckled. "Not officially, though I must admit, I once found myself halfway up the stairs before being promptly told off by the caretaker. But I remember the view from the windows, how the whole village looked so small, yet so full of life. That memory still shines in my mind, as clear as if it were yesterday." Ferb, who rarely spoke, gave his father a knowing nod, as though he understood perfectly the pull of old structures, the way they seemed to whisper their age. Candace, pretending not to be interested, found herself picturing the village, too. It was always like this with Lawrence's stories. They crept into the imagination, uninvited, yet welcome. Another memory he shared was of his grandmother's house, filled with items that seemed ancient even then. There was a worn rocking chair that creaked with every sway, a tall wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar, and shelves stacked with books whose pages had grown soft with time. As a child, Lawrence would sit cross-legged on the rug while his grandmother spoke of the past, much as he now did with his own children. "She taught me," he said softly, "that every object is more than what it appears. A teacup is not just porcelain. It is hands that held it, lips that touched it, conversations that filled the air while it sat on the table." That lesson never left me. Linda listened fondly, her smile carrying a touch of nostalgia of her own. She had always admired Lawrence's ability to hold on to such warmth in his memories. It wasn't just that he remembered events. It was that he remembered feelings, the texture of moments long gone, and carried them forward with care. Sometimes Lawrence's recollections grew even broader, stretching back to stories told by his parents and grandparents about the world before his time. He would repeat them faithfully, knowing full well that even these hand-me-down tales had value. "History is not only in books or museums," he often said. "It is in our families, in the words passed from one generation to the next. Each story adds another layer to who we are." This philosophy resonated deeply with Phineas and Ferb. Their inventions were often about looking forward, imagining what could be. But through their father's stories, they learned to respect what had been. It created a balance in their young minds, a reminder that innovation was most meaningful when it honored the past as much as the future. Candace, though she would never admit it out loud, found comfort in her father's way of anchoring life to a larger whole. In moments when she felt unseen or overwhelmed, the idea that her own experiences might one day become cherished memories for someone else gave her quiet reassurance. Even the neighbors of Danville were touched by Lawrence's gentle reminiscence. When he spoke at community gatherings, sharing tales of old craftsmanship or family traditions, people often left with a softened expression, as though reminded of something they had nearly forgotten. In a town where days were often filled with Phineas and Ferb's spectacular inventions or Perry's hidden adventures, Lawrence offered something different, an invitation to slow down and remember. As night fell and the lamps glowed warmly in the Fletcher home, Lawrence's voice often lingered in the air, weaving the past into the present. And though the children might wander off to sketch an idea, or Candace might retreat to her room, the stories remained like threads gently binding the family together across time. Danville, at first glance, seemed like a modern town, brimming with the energy of its inventive children and the cheerful chaos of everyday life. Yet to Lawrence Fletcher, the city held a quiet history that most overlooked. The past was tucked into its corners, beneath layers of paint, inside forgotten attics, and along the well-worn sidewalks that had carried generations of footsteps. When Lawrence strolled through town, he often found himself pausing to admire details others rushed past. An old lamppost with a faint maker's mark still etched near the base. A row of buildings whose bricks carried subtle variations, revealing which had been replaced over time. A rusted sign in a back alley advertising a shop that had closed decades ago. None of these were extraordinary on their own, but together they told a story of a town that had grown and shifted, carrying its memories forward. He sometimes spoke of these discoveries to Phineas and Ferb as they walked with him. "See here," he would say, pointing to a faded carving in the stone near the park fountain. This was likely the work of a craftsman long ago. Imagine the care he took, never knowing that children would still play here many years later. Phineas would lean in, fascinated, while Ferb traced the carving with quiet respect. To Lawrence, such small acts of noticing were a way of honoring the countless hands that had shaped their home. Even Candace, though less eager, found herself drawn to the way her father could make the ordinary seem special. A bench was not merely a bench. It was a seat worn smooth by laughter and conversations. A street corner was not simply a place to cross, but a spot where people had once greeted each other, exchanged news, and hurried through rainy afternoons. Slowly she began to realize that her own memories were layering upon those of the past, and someday someone else might notice traces of her life here. The antique shop became, in many ways, a reflection of Danville itself. People brought items in to sell or donate, and Lawrence listened closely as they shared fragments of history. An old violin once played in school concerts. A pair of spectacles carried in a pocket for years. A toy train that had delighted a child long grown. These were not treasures in the grand sense, but in Lawrence's eyes they were priceless, threads of community woven together. He made it his mission not only to preserve the items, but to preserve the stories as well. He kept a small journal behind the counter, jotting down details that customers mentioned. "Belonged to Mr. Green's father," one note read. "Played in the summer festival of '68. Another said, "Gift to Mrs. Turner on her wedding day." Each entry was short yet full of life, ensuring the memory would not fade completely. The townsfolk came to admire this practice, and soon they began to stop by the shop, not only to browse, but to reminisce. Lawrence became known not just as the man who sold antiques, but as a gentle keeper of Danville's history. His soft voice and kind patience encouraged others to share, and in doing so, they found comfort in remembering. On quiet nights, when the shop was closed and the streets outside had settled into stillness, Lawrence often lit a single lamp and sat among the shelves. He would turn the pages of his journal, reading the little notes aloud as though speaking the names and moments back into the world. Sometimes Linda would join him, a cup of tea in hand, smiling at the way he honored the community. Other times, Phineas and Ferb would sit cross-legged nearby, sketching inventions inspired by the past. Even Candace would wander in on occasion, listening without admitting it. For Lawrence, these moments confirmed what he had always believed, that stories are not confined to books or museums. They live in towns, in families, in the quiet hum of everyday life. And by paying attention, by remembering with care, one can feel connected not only to history, but to the steady passage of time itself. As the lamp flickered and the shop filled with the gentle hush of night, Lawrence leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of memory settle around him. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new chances to notice the subtle traces of the past, and he would be ready, with listening ears and an open heart, to keep those stories alive. Lawrence Fletcher never thought of himself as a teacher in the formal sense. He did not stand before chalkboards, nor did he assign lessons to be memorized. And yet, within the quiet rhythm of his life, he taught his children every day. His guidance was not loud or forceful. It came in soft reminders, patient listening, and the kind of steady example that children notice more than words. In the Fletcher household, mornings often began with a gentle chaos. Phineas was usually the first to leap from bed, filled with an idea too grand to wait. Ferb, ever calm, followed behind, already calculating how to bring his brother's vision to life. Candace stumbled out later, caught between her teenage desire to sleep in and her determination to keep her brothers in check. Amid all this energy, Lawrence's presence was like the steady tick of a clock, a calming rhythm that made the day feel anchored. He never discouraged Phineas's wild enthusiasm. Instead, he would ask thoughtful questions that nudged the boy toward deeper reflection. "That's a splendid idea, Phineas," he would say with genuine warmth. "Now, how do you suppose you might make it safe for everyone to enjoy?" It was not a scolding, but a gentle invitation to think responsibly. Phineas, eager to impress, would pause just long enough to add a safety rail or a seatbelt to whatever contraption was being dreamed up. Ferb, with his quiet nod, often handled the practical adjustments. Candace, meanwhile, needed a different kind of guidance. Her world was filled with frustrations, her brother's inventions, her mother's disbelief, the pressures of growing up. Lawrence saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her sighs seemed heavier than they should for someone her age. He never dismissed her concerns outright. Instead, he listened with a patience that surprised her. "It sounds like you've had a difficult day, darling," he would say, setting down his teacup. "Tell me what's on your mind." Sometimes Candace would vent in a flood of words, and sometimes she would simply huff and retreat to her room. Either way, Lawrence made sure she knew he was listening. In his mind, guiding his children was not about solving every problem for them, but about giving them the space to grow. When Phineas's projects went awry, he offered encouragement rather than blame. "Well, every inventor faces a setback now and then," he said once. After a particularly ambitious attempt at a backyard amusement park collapsed into a tangle of beams. "What matters is that you tried and that you'll learn something from it." The sparkle in Phineas's eyes returned almost immediately, while Ferb adjusted his blueprints with quiet determination. Lawrence carried this philosophy because it had been given to him in his own youth. His parents had been gentle guides as well, teaching him that kindness often lasted longer than correction. He remembered the way his father once told him, after a childhood mistake, "The world is full of lessons, my boy. The important thing is not to avoid mistakes, but to notice what they teach you. Lawrence had never forgotten that, and now he passed it on to his children in subtle ways. Linda often teased him, saying, "You're like a counselor, Lawrence. The kids never even realize they're learning from you." He would only smile modestly, not seeking recognition. To him, fatherhood was not about grandeur, it was about presence. It was in being there when Phineas's ideas bloomed, when Ferb's quiet brilliance shone, and when Candace's struggles felt too heavy for her to carry alone. Even small daily routines became lessons in Lawrence's hands. When he helped Ferb repair a toy, he demonstrated patience. When he read aloud at bedtime, he demonstrated the power of imagination. When he apologized for forgetting something, he demonstrated humility. These were not lectures, but lived examples, and the children absorbed them quietly, perhaps without realizing it at first. For Lawrence, guiding his children was like tending a garden. One did not force flowers to bloom, but rather ensured that the soil was rich, the sunlight gentle, and the water steady. In time, growth came naturally. His role, as he saw it, was simply to provide the conditions in which kindness, creativity, and resilience could flourish. And so, in the quiet moments of Danville life, Lawrence Fletcher became a gentle teacher, not through authority, but through love. His guidance was woven into the laughter around the dinner table, the calm words after a mishap, and the small encouragements that reminded his children that they were seen and cherished. Some of Lawrence's most memorable lessons to his children came not in the form of advice, but through the sharing of his own experiences. He believed that stories carried wisdom more gently than rules ever could, and when his children were willing to listen, he found ways to wrap guidance in narrative. One evening, after a long day filled with Phineas and Ferb's latest invention, the family sat together in the living room. The boys were tinkering with scraps of metal. Candace lounged on the couch with her arms crossed, and Linda hummed softly in the kitchen. Lawrence opened a wooden box that had been sitting on the shelf. Inside was a chess set, its pieces worn smooth from years of use. "Ah," he said warmly, "this set belonged to my father. He taught me how to play when I was about your age, Phineas. I used to lose every single match, but I learned something important each time." Phineas's curiosity lit up instantly. "What did you learn, Dad?" "That patience," Lawrence replied with a smile, "and that sometimes moving one piece carefully is far wiser than rushing several pieces thoughtlessly." He set the board on the table, arranging the pieces with practiced care. "Would you like me to teach you?" Phineas nodded eagerly, and even Ferb leaned closer, his eyes bright with interest. Candace rolled her eyes, but her gaze lingered on the board. As Lawrence explained the rules, he slipped in bits of gentle wisdom. "The pawns may seem small, but never underestimate them. Every piece, no matter how simple, has its place, much like people. Wouldn't you agree?" The boys nodded thoughtfully, and Candace found herself listening despite her best efforts. Lawrence guided them through a game, praising small insights, encouraging them when mistakes were made. "Losing a game," he told them, "is never a failure. It's simply another step toward understanding." Another time, he used gardening as a quiet lesson. On weekends, Lawrence often tended a small patch of flowers behind the house. Phineas and Ferb sometimes helped, though their attempts at improving the garden with elaborate watering systems often got a bit out of hand. Candace rarely joined in, preferring to watch from a distance. Still, Lawrence always welcomed their participation. "Gardens," he explained while pressing soil around the roots of a new plant, "teach us patience better than most things. You cannot rush a bloom. You must water, nurture, and wait. And even then, some flowers will not grow as you expect. That doesn't mean you failed. It simply means each plant has its own way of becoming what it's meant to be." Phineas took the words to heart, remarking that Maybe inventions were like gardens too, sometimes needing time to work properly. Ferb, with his usual quiet insight, adjusted the sprinkler system to a gentler setting. And Candace, though she would not admit it, remembered her father's words the next time she felt frustrated at school, whispering to herself that not everything had to happen at once. Lawrence's guidance extended beyond lessons of patience. He also taught kindness in the smallest interactions. When a neighbor once misplaced her dog, Lawrence was among the first to help search. He involved his children, showing them how even the simplest acts of assistance could ease someone's worry. "We do not help because it is convenient," he explained when the dog was finally found. "We help because others would do the same for us. That is how communities remain strong." The children absorbed this philosophy more than they realized. Phineas and Ferb, though always dreaming of grand adventures, were quick to lend a hand around town, whether building a ramp for someone who needed it or fixing a squeaky swing set in the park. Candace, though caught in her teenage struggles, grew into a young woman with a heart that often surprised her. She might grumble about her brothers, but she showed the same compassion when a friend was upset or when someone at school felt left out. Through all these moments, Lawrence never raised his voice, never forced a lesson. He allowed the rhythm of life to provide the stage, and he offered his thoughts with humility. His role as a father was not to control, but to guide, an invisible hand that steadied without restraining. And though his children sometimes rolled their eyes or hurried on, his words remained with them like seeds planted in good soil, waiting for the right season to bloom. Guidance often shines brightest in moments of difficulty, and Lawrence Fletcher had a quiet gift for recognizing when his children needed more than simple encouragement. He seemed to sense when a setback weighed heavily on their hearts, when excitement had faded into disappointment, or when frustration threatened to overshadow joy. In those moments, he offered not solutions, but comfort, the kind that allowed them to see themselves more clearly. One afternoon, Phineas and Ferb's latest invention had collapsed spectacularly. They had attempted to build a musical roller coaster, one where each twist and turn would play a note, creating a grand melody as the cars sped along. But midway through testing, the track had bent under its own weight, sending pieces scattering across the yard. Though no one was hurt, the project ended in silence, and the cheerful rhythm broken. Phineas sat on the grass, his usually bright face dimmed. "It was supposed to work," he muttered, staring at the broken beams. Ferb patted his shoulder, but even his calm presence couldn't lift the mood entirely. Lawrence, who had been reading nearby, closed his book gently and joined them. He didn't rush in with fixes or blueprints. He simply sat beside his sons, allowing the quiet to settle first. After a while, he said, "You know, when I was about your age, I tried to build a model ship. I imagined it would sail across the pond near my home, tall and proud. But the moment I placed it in the water, it sank straight to the bottom." Phineas looked up surprised. "Really? It didn't work at all?" "Not even for a moment," Lawrence replied with a chuckle. "But I learned something that day. I learned that the joy wasn't only in the sailing. It was in the building, in the trying, in the hope I carried with me. And the next time I built a ship, it floated. Not perfectly, mind you, but better than before." Ferb's eyes softened as he listened, and Phineas's spark began to return. The failure didn't feel so heavy when placed beside his father's story. It became part of a larger pattern, one where mistakes were simply stepping stones. By evening, the boys were already sketching new ideas, buoyed by Lawrence's gentle perspective. Candace, too, often found comfort in her father's quiet guidance, though she rarely sought it out directly. There were evenings when she came home upset, Perhaps a friend had hurt her feelings, or she had stumbled on a test at school. Lawrence never pressed her to talk, but he made himself available, often by sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, humming softly. Eventually, Candace would ease into the room, sighing as she dropped into a chair. "It just feels like no one takes me seriously," she said once, her voice heavy with frustration. Lawrence looked at her with kind eyes. "I know that feeling well," he said. "When I was young, people often thought me absent-minded. They would smile politely and move on, not realizing that I had ideas and dreams of my own. It was discouraging, yes, but I learned something important. We must value our own voices before expecting others to. When you know your worth, darling, others will begin to see it too." Candace didn't reply at first, but his words lingered. She straightened slightly in her chair, as though borrowing a bit of his quiet strength. Lawrence never expected gratitude in the moment. He trusted that his guidance would take root in time. There were also these smaller, everyday comforts. When Phineas became too restless, Lawrence reminded him to pause and breathe. When Ferb grew lost in the details of a project, Lawrence gently encouraged him to step back and look at the whole picture. And when Candace grew tangled in her worries, he offered her perspective, reminding her that one mistake did not define her. What made Lawrence's guidance unique was its gentleness. He did not demand obedience, nor did he push too hard. Instead, he created a space where his children felt safe to falter, to question, to try again. In his presence, failure lost its sting, and doubts became smaller. His voice, soft yet steady, reminded them that they were capable, loved, and growing. The children might not have realized it fully, but these moments shaped them deeply. Phineas carried an unshakable optimism into each new idea. Ferb approached challenges with quiet resilience, and Candace, despite her anxieties, began to find strength in her own determination. Each trait, nurtured by their father's steady guidance, would remain with them long after childhood faded. The beauty of Lawrence Fletcher's guidance was not only in the words he spoke, but in the way he lived. His children saw in him a model of kindness, patience, and humility, qualities that quietly impressed themselves upon their own hearts. Without lectures or sternness, he showed them what it meant to move through the world with thoughtfulness. On weekends, for instance, Lawrence would sometimes wander with his children through the streets of Danville. They would pause at the bookstore, where he encouraged them to choose a story that spoke to their imagination, or at the art supply shop, where Ferb's eyes lit up at the rows of brushes and paints. Lawrence never hurried them along. He let curiosity set the pace. "The world reveals itself to those who linger," he often said. At home, his lessons continued in the smallest gestures. If a neighbor stopped by, Lawrence welcomed them warmly, modeling hospitality. If the family gathered for dinner, he listened more than he spoke, teaching the importance of valuing others' voices. Even in mundane tasks, fixing a loose hinge, sweeping the porch, or folding laundry, he demonstrated patience. To Lawrence, every moment was an opportunity to show care, and his children absorbed those lessons almost unconsciously. One evening, Phineas grew restless as bedtime approached. His mind still buzzed with ideas, too alive to settle down. Lawrence joined him on the porch where the crickets hummed softly in the grass. "Sometimes," Lawrence said, "our thoughts feel like fireflies, flitting about, impossible to catch all at once. The trick isn't to chase them, but to let them settle in their own time." Phineas leaned against his father's arm, and the restless energy softened. He didn't need to capture every thought that night. It was enough to know they would return tomorrow, ready to be explored. Ferb, meanwhile, often found himself caught between his natural creativity and his quiet nature. He sometimes worried that his silence made him invisible, But Lawrence, in his gentle way, reassured him. Your voice may not always be spoken, Ferb, but it shines in what you build, in the way you listen, in the kindness you show. Silence, too, can be powerful. Those words lingered, strengthening Ferb's quiet confidence in who he was. And Candace, despite her many frustrations, discovered something else in her father's guidance: acceptance. He never dismissed her worries, no matter how small they seemed. He simply listened, letting her know that her feelings mattered. Over time, she came to see that she didn't need to earn her worth. She already had it in his eyes. That realization gave her courage she didn't even know she carried. In all of this, Lawrence's role was less about giving answers and more about showing the way. His steady presence offered reassurance that no problem was insurmountable, no failure permanent, and no dream too far-fetched. He guided without controlling, encouraged without pressuring, and loved without condition. As the evening deepened in the Fletcher household, Lawrence often found himself in a quiet chair, book in hand, his children nearby. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But the bond between them grew in those simple silences. His guidance didn't need to be constant. It lived in the pauses, in the examples he set, and in the love that wove through every interaction. And so, under his gentle watch, Phineas dreamed bigger, Ferb grew steadier, and Candace stood taller. The lessons of their father's quiet guidance followed them into each new day, grounding them even as their imaginations soared. Lawrence never sought recognition for this role. His joy came simply from watching his children become who they were meant to be. The heartbeat of the Fletcher household was not invention or even adventure. It was love. It pulsed quietly beneath the chaos of projects, the endless chatter, and the small quarrels of daily life. And at the center of this warmth stood Lawrence Fletcher, not as a grand conductor orchestrating every moment, but as a steady presence that kept the family together. From the outside, the Fletcher home seemed like any other in Danville, a modest house with a well-kept yard, laughter spilling from the windows, and a familiar sense of comfort. But to those who lived within its walls, it was more than a building. It was a sanctuary. It was the place where ideas bloomed, mistakes were forgiven, and every person had a place to belong. Lawrence loved nothing more than the ordinary rhythms of family life. He took delight in setting the table with care, humming softly as he placed each fork and spoon. He smiled at the small rituals that made the evening special. Candace rushing down the stairs to share the latest news with her mother, Phineas and Ferb, dragging in a new contraption they couldn't wait to explain. Vanessa visiting from time to time with a calm smile that softened her edges. To Lawrence, these were not distractions from life. They were life. Dinner was often the heart of their togetherness. The family would gather, sometimes in a tangle of half-finished projects, sometimes in bursts of laughter, sometimes in quiet reflection. Candace might talk too quickly, eager to be heard. Phineas would brim with enthusiasm about tomorrow's plans. Ferb would add a dry but clever remark at just the right moment. Linda would smile, proud and amused, while Lawrence kept the flow steady, gently steering conversations so no one felt left behind. "Tell me, Ferb," he would say in his warm voice, "what part of today's project did you enjoy most?" And though Ferb's answers were short, his eyes lit up, grateful that his thoughts were valued. Lawrence had a way of making each family member feel seen. Candace, who so often felt overshadowed, found reassurance in his attention. Phineas, whose imagination sometimes leapt too quickly for others to follow, found grounding in his father's steady encouragement. Ferb, who preferred to speak through action, knew that Lawrence noticed and appreciated even the smallest gestures. And Linda, though confident and capable, drew strength from the quiet respect and admiration Lawrence showed her each day. It was not grand speeches or dramatic gestures that created this sense of love. It was the small things. The way Lawrence kissed Linda's hand when he passed her in the kitchen. The way he kept a drawer of spare tools ready for Phineas and Ferb's projects. The way he listened patiently when Candace poured out her frustrations. These tiny actions built an atmosphere of care, so steady that it became as natural as breathing. Even in moments of tension, the warmth lingered. Candace might storm off in frustration, certain that no one understood her, but she would find her father's gentle knock on her door later that evening. "I'll be here if you'd like to talk," he'd say, leaving her with the comfort of knowing she was not alone. And when projects went awry, leaving the backyard in disarray, Lawrence never scolded. He laughed, rolled up his sleeves, and helped put things right again. What the children may not have realized was that this environment of love and family warmth was no accident. Lawrence nurtured it with intention. He believed that the greatest treasure in life was not wealth or recognition, but the bonds we build with those closest to us. In his quiet way, he made sure his children grew up in a home where love was not only spoken, but felt in every corner. As twilight settled on the Fletcher house and the family gathered for another evening together, the glow of that love filled the rooms. It was not loud, not boastful. It was steady, gentle, and enduring. And it was this love that gave the family the strength to dream, to build, and to grow together. If the household was filled with warmth, it was because the heart of that warmth began with Lawrence and Linda. Their love was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and lived out in the countless ways they supported one another. The children often saw it not in words, but in gestures. The way Linda would rest her hand on Lawrence's shoulder when she passed him, or the way he would listen attentively to her stories about her day, no matter how ordinary they might seem. Lawrence cherished Linda deeply, not just as his wife, but as the anchor of their family. He admired her strength, her ability to balance patience with firmness, and her way of caring for each child with a mother's intuition. To him, Linda was a melody, sometimes lively, sometimes calm, always carrying the rhythm of their home. He often told her so in the poetic way only he could manage. One evening, while the children were upstairs, Lawrence and Linda sat together on the couch, sharing tea. Linda sighed, a little weary from the day. "It feels like there's never a moment of quiet around here," she said, though her smile betrayed that she wouldn't trade the chaos for anything. Lawrence chuckled, leaning back. "True enough, darling, but isn't it a fine sort of noise? The sound of life itself unfolding in our living room. I dare say silence would feel far lonelier." Linda's laugh was soft, filled with affection. "I suppose you're right. Still, sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough for them. Candace, Phineas, Ferb. They're all so different, with such big needs." Lawrence reached for her hand, his touch reassuring. "We love them. We listen to them. That, I believe, is enough. They'll find their way, with us as their guideposts." The children didn't always hear conversations like these, but they felt the result. Their parents' love was the foundation on which their own confidence and security rested. It was in the way Linda and Lawrence spoke to each other with kindness, even when they disagreed. It was in the way they laughed together, their joy spilling into the rest of the house. For Lawrence, being a loving husband was inseparable from being a devoted father. He believed that the way he treated Linda would teach his children what respect and affection looked like. And so, whether it was complimenting her cooking, helping with chores without being asked, or simply sharing quiet moments together. He lived his lesson before them each day. Sometimes the children would stumble upon these small displays of affection. Candace once rolled her eyes dramatically when she found her parents dancing slowly in the kitchen to a song on the radio. "Seriously, you two?" she groaned, though secretly the sight gave her comfort. Phineas grinned at the scene, already wondering if he and Ferb could build a machine to add music to every room. Ferb, as always, smiled quietly, content to watch. Though the children didn't say it aloud, these glimpses of their parents' love left an imprint. They showed Candace that relationships could be steady rather than confusing. They reminded Phineas that love didn't need to be loud to be powerful. And they assured Ferb that warmth could exist even in silence. Lawrence, for his part, knew that love was not about perfection. He and Linda had their disagreements, as all couples do. But he approached them with patience and humility. He valued listening over winning, compromise over pride. And in doing so, he showed his children that love was not the absence of conflict. It was the willingness to walk through it together. As the evening grew late, Lawrence and Linda sat side by side, their hands intertwined. The house was never truly still, but in that moment, a peaceful quiet seemed to wrap around them. Their bond, simple and strong, radiated through the walls of the home, filling every room with the warmth that would nurture their children's dreams for years to come. Love in the Fletcher home was not reserved for special occasions. It showed itself in the everyday moments, in the smallest gestures that, when woven together, created a tapestry of belonging. Lawrence, in particular, had a way of noticing those little things, the sigh Candace tried to hide, and the sparkle in Phineas's eyes when a new idea took hold, the quiet pride in Ferb's posture when a project succeeded. Each detail mattered to him, for each detail was part of the family's heartbeat. One afternoon, Candace came home from school looking especially discouraged. She dropped her bag by the door and flopped dramatically onto the couch, muttering about how unfair life was. Linda offered her sympathy, but it was Lawrence who gently sat beside her. He didn't press for details, nor did he dismiss her frustration. Instead, he offered her a cup of tea, her favorite kind, with just enough sugar. Candace sighed, sitting up reluctantly. "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice softer. Lawrence simply smiled, content to let the warmth of the tea and the comfort of his presence do the work. Later, when she was ready, she told him everything, and though he didn't fix her problem, his listening alone lightened the weight she carried. Phineas and Ferb often experienced their father's warmth in more active ways. He would join them in the yard, not to direct their inventions, but to celebrate them. When the boys unveiled a half-finished contraption, Lawrence's eyes lit up with genuine wonder. "Brilliant! Absolutely brilliant!" he'd exclaim, even if the device sputtered or tilted dangerously to one side. To him, the marvel was not in perfection, but in the courage to create. On one occasion, Phineas tried to explain the workings of a complicated machine. His words tumbled quickly, full of enthusiasm, but Lawrence nodded along, never once making his son feel too fast or too much. "I admit, I don't quite follow all the mechanics," he said with a chuckle. "But I do follow this. You put your heart into it, and that's what makes it wonderful." Phineas beamed, feeling truly understood. Ferb, who was more reserved, often received his father's love in subtler forms. Lawrence respected his silence, never pushing him to speak more than he wished. Instead, he found other ways to connect. Sharing a glance of approval when Ferb completed a drawing, setting aside old tools for him to repurpose, or quietly sitting nearby while Ferb tinkered. Their bond did not rely on words, but on presence, and Ferb treasured that unspoken understanding. Even Vanessa, though not living in the Fletcher household full-time, was drawn into this web of warmth. Lawrence welcomed her with the same affection he gave his own children. When she visited, he always had a place set for her at the table, and he asked about her interests with genuine curiosity. To Vanessa, who sometimes felt overshadowed by the peculiarities of her own family, this quiet acceptance was a gift. She felt at home, not because of grand gestures, but because Lawrence made her feel she belonged. Family warmth also thrived in the simple traditions Lawrence helped cultivate. Movie nights with mismatched blankets, pancakes on Sunday mornings, or spontaneous backyard games where everyone laughed until their sides ached. These were the moments that stitched them together. The traditions were not perfect. Sometimes the pancakes burned or the projector jammed during the best scene. But Lawrence always turned mishaps into memories, reminding his children that love didn't depend on everything going smooth. Echale, what made this warmth so enduring was its consistency. It wasn't a rare treat, but a daily presence, like the glow of a lamp that was always left on, softly illuminating the path. For the children, it became the background of their lives, so steady that they sometimes forgot how extraordinary it was. Only later would they look back and realize that it was their father's love that gave shape to their happiest memories. As the day faded into evening, Lawrence often paused to look around the room. The sound of laughter, the sight of his children sprawled comfortably across couches and chairs, the simple peace of being together. These were treasures beyond measure. He needed nothing more than this, his family, gathered in warmth, their love flowing quietly from one to another. The warmth of family life always seemed to shine brightest in the quiet evenings, when the world outside slowed down and the Fletcher home settled into its own gentle rhythm. These were the moments Lawrence cherished most, not because of anything extraordinary, but because of their simplicity. A lamp's glow on the living room rug, the distant clatter of dishes being washed, the hum of contentment that seemed to float through every room. On one such evening, the family gathered in the living room after dinner. Candace sprawled on the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through a magazine. Phineas and Ferb sat on the floor with a puzzle spread between them, their heads bent together in concentration. Linda brought in a tray with cocoa, and Lawrence followed with a plate of biscuits, setting them down with a cheerful, "Help yourselves, everyone." It was an ordinary scene, but in its ordinariness lay its magic. Candace, sipping her cocoa, felt her frustrations of the day begin to fade. Phineas hummed softly as he studied the puzzle pieces, his boundless energy softened by the calm. Ferb leaned comfortably against the couch, his quiet presence steady as ever. Linda, watching them all, felt the weight of her responsibilities lighten, and Lawrence, seated in his favorite chair, let his eyes rest on each member of his family, his heart swelling with quiet pride. What Lawrence understood, perhaps better than anyone, was that love did not need to be grand to be powerful. It lived in gestures so small they might almost go unnoticed. The way Linda brushed Candace's hair out of her eyes, the way Phineas offered Ferb the last biscuit, the way Ferb placed an extra cushion behind his father's back without a word. These were the threads of family warmth, binding them together stronger than any invention or plan could. Sometimes the family told stories in these evenings. Lawrence, with his love of history, often began. He would recall a ship he once saw in London, or a curious artifact he found in an antique shop. And the children would listen with wide eyes. And before long, Candace would add her own anecdotes from school. Phineas would spin wild what-ifs about their next adventure, and Ferb would chime in with a perfectly timed remark that sent everyone into laughter. The room filled with voices, weaving past and present, reality and imagination, into one tapestry of togetherness. And then there were nights when no one felt like talking much at all. Those evenings, the family simply sat together, each lost in their own thoughts, but still bound by the comfort of shared presence. Lawrence believed those silences were just as valuable as the chatter. They taught his children that love was not always about words or action. It was about being together in peace. As the evening wore on, the warmth of the cocoa, the laughter of stories, and the quiet strength of their bond settled into everyone's hearts. One by one, the children drifted toward sleep, Candace dozing lightly on the couch, Phineas yawning between puzzle pieces, Ferb's eyelids heavy but determined to finish the task. Linda gathered blankets, tucking them around the children with practiced ease. Lawrence lingered a moment longer, watching the scene with tender eyes. He knew these days would not last forever. Children grow, seasons change, life moves on. But in that instant, he felt time pause. He saw his family bathed in the glow of love, safe and content, and he knew this was the true measure of a life well lived. The house grew quieter as the night deepened, the warmth of the evening still echoing softly in every corner. And within that warmth, Lawrence felt certainty that love, once given, never truly fades. It lingers, shaping hearts, guiding steps, and carrying a family forward into tomorrow. The Fletcher home was more than a house of walls and windows. It was a living place, filled with memories, laughter, and quiet moments that made it a true sanctuary. And at its very heart stood Lawrence Fletcher, not in a commanding way, but in the gentle presence he carried into every room. He was not the loudest voice, nor the most dramatic, but somehow everything felt steadier when he was there. Lawrence believed that a home was built not only of bricks and beams, but of kindness and care. He carried this belief into the smallest details of family life. He was the one who kept the umbrella stand by the door ready for rainy days, who polished the old clock on the mantel because its steady ticking comforted the household, who left soft lights glowing at night so the children never woke to complete darkness. These details may have seemed trivial, but together they created an atmosphere of safety. The children rarely thought about how much their father shaped the feeling of home, but they lived within it every day. When Phineas and Ferb charged into the kitchen with blueprints in hand, Lawrence greeted them not with worry, but with delight, making their ideas feel welcome. When Candace grew restless and overwhelmed, the house itself seemed to soften under Lawrence's calming influence, as though his presence carried through the walls. One rainy afternoon captured this essence perfectly. The children had been disappointed that their outdoor plans were ruined, and Candace was especially grumpy, pacing the living room. Lawrence, instead of trying to push them into cheerfulness, simply set the mood. He lit a lamp, set a record spinning on the player, and brewed a pot of cocoa. Soon the sound of gentle music filled the air, the scent of cocoa drifted through the room, and the rain outside seemed less of a burden and more of a backdrop. Phineas leaned against the window, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. "You know this isn't so bad," he admitted, his earlier disappointment fading. Ferb nodded, already sketching something new on a pad of paper. Candace sighed, but curled up with a blanket, her mood softened by the comfort of the room. Lawrence said little, but his quiet choices had transformed what could have been a dreary day into one of warmth. The house, under his touch, became a refuge from the storm, reminding his children that even disappointments could hold their own kind of peace. This was the gift Lawrence gave again and again. Not dramatic solutions, but the steady creation of a home where everyone felt safe, loved, and valued. He understood that a true home was not about perfection. It was about belonging, and in his presence, each member of the family knew they belonged completely. As evening drew in, the rain slowed, leaving the streets of Danville glistening beneath the lamplight. From the window, Lawrence watched the last drops fade, his children settled nearby in the glow of the lamp. He felt the quiet truth that had always guided him. The greatest adventures were not found only in inventions or journeys, but in the love and comfort shared within the heart of home. Lawrence often reflected on how homes carried echoes of the people who lived within them. He had learned this from his own childhood, where his father had kept an old study filled with books and trinkets from travels abroad. As a boy, Lawrence had marveled at the shelves of curiosities, each object carrying its own story. Now, as a father himself, he tried to create that same sense of wonder and warmth for his family. The Fletcher home reflected this philosophy in quiet but meaningful ways. A wall in the hallway displayed framed sketches and photographs, not arranged for perfect balance, but with a sense of memory and affection. Candace's earliest finger paintings hung next to Ferb's carefully drawn schematics, and Phineas's doodles found space beside an old family photograph of Linda at a concert. Each piece told a part of the family's story, woven together like threads in a tapestry. Lawrence believed strongly in honoring traditions, no matter how small. Each Sunday morning, he prepared breakfast in a way that had become a ritual. Pancakes in different shapes, inspired by the children's requests. Phineas once asked for a star, Ferb a gear, and Candace, half amused and half exasperated, once demanded a perfectly ordinary circle. Lawrence obliged them all, and though the shapes often came out lopsided, the ritual itself mattered more than perfection. The children would remember these mornings, not for flawless pancakes, but for the laughter that rose as their father tried to flip his creations without collapsing them. Evening routines carried their own rhythm. Lawrence liked to read before bed, and he passed this habit to his children, not by instruction but by example. Sometimes the house fell into a gentle silence as everyone found their own corner with a book. Candace curled on the sofa with a mystery novel, Phineas sprawled on the floor with a comic, and Ferb sat upright in a chair with a technical manual. Lawrence, with his own adventure tale in hand, would occasionally glance around the room and smile. He treasured those quiet evenings where each member of the family shared the same space, absorbed in their own worlds, yet connected by the stillness of being together. The heart of home also lived in how Lawrence responded to the moments when life grew overwhelming. Candace, with her strong will and determination, often grew frustrated when her efforts to prove something went unnoticed. Lawrence would listen patiently, nodding at her hurried explanations. He rarely interrupted. Instead, he let her words settle until she sighed and sat down beside him. Only then would he offer his calm perspective, never dismissing her struggles, but reminding her gently that she was more than her frustrations. These talks never ended with loud conclusions, but with Candace leaning her head on his shoulder, comforted by the quiet certainty of his presence. Phineas, always bursting with ideas, sometimes forgot to pause. On those days, Lawrence's guidance came not in lectures, but in questions. "And what will you do after that, my boy?" he would ask, prompting Phineas to think beyond the excitement of the moment. Ferb needed fewer words. Sometimes just a nod of approval or a shared silence was enough. Lawrence understood each of his children differently, and he shaped the home around those differences, ensuring that no one felt unseen. It was in this careful balance between tradition and spontaneity, guidance and freedom, that the Fletcher household found its rhythm. And while visitors often marveled at the children's inventions, it was Lawrence's invisible influence that gave the family its steady heartbeat. The walls of the house did not simply contain their lives. They reflected the care of a father who believed that love, expressed in countless small ways, was the truest foundation of any home. Every family carried its share of challenges, but in the Fletcher household, those challenges seemed softened by the way Lawrence approached them. He believed in handling difficulties with patience and warmth, never allowing the household to lose its balance. To him, home was not a place where problems disappeared, but where they could be shared and made lighter together. There was one evening when Candace stormed into the house, clearly upset. She had spent the whole day trying to catch her brothers in the act of one of their larger-than-life projects, only to find it gone before her mother returned. Her frustration spilled out in fast words, her voice rising with every sentence. Linda, busy at the stove, looked over sympathetically, but reminded Candace she couldn't always keep watch over her brother's schemes. Lawrence, noticing Candace's frown deepen, stepped in gently. He didn't argue with her or insist that she calm down. Instead, he invited her into the study. The room smelled faintly of old books and polish, a space that always carried a sense of calm. He let Candace pace, her words tumbling out until her energy ran low. Only then did he sit down and say, in his quiet way, "Sometimes, my dear, it feels as though the world is determined not to listen to us. But home, at least, should be a place where you are always heard." Candace blinked at him, a little startled. Slowly, she sat across from him, her anger easing. It wasn't that her frustration disappeared. It was that her father gave it a place to rest. And though she didn't say it aloud, she left the study with lighter steps, knowing she had been understood. Phineas, too, found comfort in the home Lawrence shaped. His projects often ended in triumph, but not every idea unfolded perfectly. One afternoon, his invention failed spectacularly, scattering pieces across the yard. Though Phineas quickly brushed it off, insisting he'd try again, Lawrence noticed the flicker of disappointment behind his son's smile. Later, when the tools were put away, Lawrence found Phineas in the living room, staring at the ceiling. He sat beside him and, without forcing the matter, began to tell a story of one of his own boyhood failures. How he had once tried to build a kite so large it tangled in half the neighborhood trees. Phineas laughed at the image, and the weight of his own disappointment lightened. "So, even you mess things up sometimes?" he asked. "Quite often, my boy," Lawrence chuckled. "And yet, each time, I found a reason to try again." You see, the heart of a home isn't in never failing. It's in always having a place to return where you can gather yourself before the next try. Ferb's relationship with his father required fewer words. Sometimes the boy simply sat beside Lawrence in silence, building something small or sketching plans. Lawrence would nod occasionally, offering a comment only when it felt right, respecting Ferb's quiet nature. It was an understanding built not on endless conversation but on trust, that Ferb could exist just as he was, without pressure to speak more than he wished. Even Linda felt the weight of Lawrence's steady presence. After a long day, she would find herself easing into the rhythm of home he maintained. The soft lamps, the kettle ready, the atmosphere unhurried. Lawrence never demanded grand gestures of affection. Instead, he showed love through constancy, the sort of reliable warmth that made the house feel not just like shelter, but like sanctuary. The children might not have realized it at the time, but years later they would look back and see how profoundly their father's way of being shaped the feeling of home. In every corner of the house, his influence lingered, in the framed memories on the walls, in the laughter shared during meals, in the small traditions he created and maintained. The house became not just the place where they lived, but a place that lived with them, growing richer with every story, every lesson, every quiet evening together. As days turned into years, the Fletcher home became a patchwork of stories, each layered gently on the last. Birthdays and celebrations brought bursts of excitement, but it was the everyday rhythm that truly gave the house its heartbeat. It was in the way shoes gathered by the door after afternoons spent outside, in the way laughter drifted up the stairs, and in the soft glow of lamps that marked each evening's close. Lawrence had quietly shaped all of it, his gentle guidance becoming the invisible thread that held the household together. He often thought of home as a kind of music, not loud and commanding, but steady and comforting, like a familiar tune one could hum without thinking. The children's voices were the melody, bright, surprising, and sometimes chaotic, while his role was to provide the harmony beneath. Together with Linda, he ensured that the song never faltered, even when life outside their walls grew noisy or uncertain. One particular evening captured this perfectly. The family had gathered for dinner, each of them carrying the weight of a long day. Candace muttered about a failed plan, Phineas bounced with half-formed ideas for tomorrow, and Ferb sat quietly, his mind elsewhere. Lawrence didn't try to control the conversation. Instead, he asked Candace about her day with genuine interest, gave Phineas a patient ear, and offered Ferb a knowing smile that said he didn't need words to be understood. Slowly, the energy of the room softened. By the time dessert arrived, laughter had replaced weariness, and the worries of the day felt lighter. After dinner, Lawrence found himself standing in the doorway of the living room, watching his family settle into their evening routines. Candace sprawled across the couch with her phone. Phineas and Ferb busied themselves, sketching plans for tomorrow, and Linda hummed softly in the kitchen as she tidied. The sight filled him with quiet joy. He didn't need recognition or grand gestures. Simply being the anchor of this place, this family, was enough. He knew that his children might not always notice the subtle ways he shaped the home. They might grow up remembering grand inventions, thrilling adventures, or their own personal triumphs. Yet Lawrence trusted that, when they thought of home, they would feel the warmth he had worked so gently to weave into its walls, a warmth that told them, no matter where they went, no matter how far they traveled, there was always a place where they belonged. As the evening drew on, Lawrence sat in his favorite chair, a book resting on his lap, though he hardly turned the pages. The house was calm, each room glowing softly, the air filled with the faint sounds of family life. He felt a deep, steady contentment. Here was the truth he had come to understand. The heart of home was not in its walls or its roof, but in the love that pulsed quietly through it, day after day. And he, in his gentle, steadfast way, was its keeper. In the stillness of that night, with the family safe and near, Lawrence Fletcher smiled to himself. He knew his story was not about bold adventures or daring feats. His legacy was simpler, but no less important. He was the warmth in the hearth, the calm in the storm, the steady presence that made a house into a home. And in that role, he had found his greatest purpose. And so we reached the close of Lawrence Fletcher's tale. His story wasn't one of grand inventions or daring escapades, but of quiet strength, gentle care, and the love that made a house into a home. Through patience, warmth, and small traditions, he showed that the truest adventures happen not in distant lands, but in the moments we share with the people closest to us. As you drift off tonight, may you carry with you the comfort of Lawrence's world, a reminder that home is not just a place, but a feeling. Thank you for joining us for this journey, and may your dreams be as peaceful as the heart of home itself.